Hi there. I'd like to introduce our adaptive capacity panel. We've got about 20 minutes to explore a couple themes with them. Adaptive capacity in uncertain times is what we're focused on. First is Mr. Chris Caskey of Delta Brick and Climate as our opening presenter last night. Hi, Chris.
Hi, folks.
Back,
Great
are
to
those,
be here.
Do you have those hooked up to, what were those old CD players called? Those headsets?
Oh yeah, no,
Walkman.
like a Walkman or something. But
I'm stuck in some pretty old technology. Jim Gusek of Linkan Engineering. Welcome back, Jim. Free spent grain for everybody that gives them a good question in the Q&A. And Emily Zmak of CDR Associates. Hi, Emily. And Summer Waters of Red Rocks Community College. Hi, Summer. So we've got a few questions that might be directed at specific individuals, but also have the opportunity for you all to jump in where you see the opportunity. Let's start at kind of high level here. You know, what is adaptive capacity and how does it pertain to mining and reclamation?
I'll take a crack at this.
Do.
When I first heard I was going to be on this panel, I said, what in the heck is adaptive capacity? So of course I Googled it. And so in essence, I'm just going to read from Wikipedia. Thank you very much. Adaptive capacity relates to the capacity of systems, institutions, humans, and other organisms to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities, and to respond to consequences. In the context of ecological systems, adaptive capacity is determined by the genetic diversity of the species. So that was the textbook discussion, or the textbook understanding of what it is. But I'm going to also share my screen with you that puts it kind of into context. So can you see, let's see if I do this properly, if I pull this up and zoom in. It shows this vulnerability circle and a resilience circle, and where they overlap is this adaptive capacity. So it's the ability of, crap happening to you and being able to respond to it, and where they overlap seems to be, this capacity, that adaptive capacity. So if that's the definition, so I'll stop sharing.
Well, we weren't going to give out points for this panel, but Jim, you lose points for Googling the answer to the question, but you get points back for bringing in a visual device. So nice job on that. Thanks, Jim.
So
anybody else?
I'm even. So
You're back to zero, Jim. Anybody else want to jump in on that adaptive capacity?
I was interested in the part of the definition about genetic diversity, and I think how that applies to an industry is diversity of background, diversity of expertise, diversity of thought process, and those are the sorts of things that are going to bring out paths forward as we deal with those vulnerabilities that we're all aware of.
Yeah, I would agree. Can everybody hear me, first of all? Just somebody give me a, yes, awesome, thank you. I would agree. So I like this, I love that diagram, Jim, and thank you for setting the stage. Anthony, you might have to take some points off of me too, because I also did some Googling in preparation for this. And yeah, this concept of resilience is really interconnected. And I think, as Chris said, as a biologist, I learned about resilience in the terms of a community. And that's when you learn about diversity. But as an engineer, then I also learned about resilience in terms of materials and the ability to bounce back. And so I think, as scientists, we're kind of ahead of the game because we've been exposed to these concepts of resilience already. And then you take it to something more complex, like a social.
Summer, are you able to speak up a little bit?
Oh, you still having trouble? All right, you can't hear me. Let's move on, and I'll make some adjustments while we move on.
And I'll just jump in. I didn't Google it, but I did do some stakeholder engagement, and I interviewed quite a few people. And I'll preface, all my answers come from a social and not a technical background. But adaptive capacity is also recognizing that you have finite resources and time, and it's the nimbleness or the skills and the systems that allow you to shift as these unforeseen circumstances come up, such as all of us on a video call from our homes for a conference would be a great example.
Way to tie it all together there, Emily. I'm sorry, but she's getting the most points so far in this game that has no prizes. But yeah, I like that. And from a social standpoint, you think about adaptive capacity, the ability to adapt and pivot, maybe even I'd use the word resilience, you know, and I think I heard you say that as well, of that, you know, we can find ways to create resilience and within communities for sure, as we kind of deal with change as they come up. Let's jump into a question. Chris, can we throw one directly at you and we'll start there? How can private enterprises inject new solutions into traditional mining and mine reclamation challenges?
Yeah, totally.
That is a great question, and I do not 100% know the answer. You know, we're working on it ourselves. The main challenge is that it's a huge stakeholder nut to crack, right? You've got the historic mines that may or may not exist, the nearby communities that may or may not want action, may or may not understand reclamation, may or may not have an understanding of the problems that are trying to be solved. And then money is always the issue. You know, the fact of the matter is, these sites are problems because there's low value, because there's not a lot of economic gain, which is what our current system entirely cares about. So you can identify spots where it's like, okay, we can do this and we can make a little bit of money with X, Y, and Z incentives. But, you know, overall, we just have to, as a society, say, hey, we got a bunch of wealth out of the last 100, 150 years of mining, and we have to give some of that back to create the future that we want, and deal with the problems that are here. So that circles back to the point of privilege that I talked about yesterday, dealing with stakeholders and getting through all the hoops that exist and getting the money together is something that creates a privilege barrier. And that privilege barrier limits our ability to have the diversity of backgrounds, diversity of voices that do contribute to adaptive capacity within an industry, just as they do within biology. So I think the first thing to do is look for solutions that can pay for themselves, work to lower privilege barriers so that more solutions are accessible, and then work with all the stakeholders to really communicate as transparently as possible the benefits that are going to exist and the impacts, because you don't get a free lunch for anything. So, end of thought.
I like it, and it sort of ties back in with when we were talking with Julie Penner before, and I asked the question of, you know, how do we do proof of concept for some of these things too, right? You're talking about low economic incentive for doing some of these things. There's also this barrier of just like, well, we don't even know if it'll work yet. And so I think you probably took on a good bit of proof of concept for your project. Where did the funding come for that initially?
Funding for my project came from the state and counties originally, about $10,000, myself about $40,000, and parents, my parents invested in my company as well, about $150,000. So we'd spent almost $200,000 by the time we had real revenue. And that's something that I try to be clear about, is that those are small numbers in the mining industry, but those are big barriers to anyone who's not coming from a place of relative wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got somebody creating some background noise in your situation there, Chris. I don't know if that's you or not.
Yes, this is the Third Street co-working space has other people on video calls right now.
Well, tell them that they haven't been invited on the panel and they're not getting compensation regardless. So Emily, let's transition over to a question for you. So you talked about stakeholder engagement and kind of this community lens that you view things through, or where you'd be providing your perspective from maybe today. So how can stakeholder engagement be leveraged to overcome challenges associated with conducting water-related projects during sort of these times of uncertainty?
And I did some thinking on this question because there's a lot we could cover. I could go into case studies or I could do a deep dive into systems. And so I just wanted to highlight 3 points in the time that we have today. The first being that stakeholders are often viewed as an insurance policy. You know, you engage people, the community members, in case something bad happens down the road. And that's selling your stakeholders short. Quite often, stakeholders have a very deep localized knowledge and can actually be partners that make your job easier. And so it's really, first off, defining where stakeholders can provide input, and then giving them the responsibility to move the needle forward in certain areas. So for an example, we do a lot of work in the I-70 mountain corridor, and our stakeholders there talk in mile markers. They know that corridor like the back of their hands. And so to be able to hand that over to them, say, you know, this is our process, here's where we're hoping you can help us, shifts from using them for a social license to really partnering. The second piece that helps, that you can use to leverage stakeholder engagement, is having systems in place now. So one of the comments in the chat was that it's hard to be nimble without money. And there is some truth to that, but there's also a sense that if you have a structure that you can lean on when you need it, you're good to go. So for me, that's having a formalized group of stakeholders. Who are your go-to people? Usually I would say I would recommend having about 10 influential community leaders at minimum. And then making sure that they're updated, having regular communication. It would depend on what type of project or operation you're having, but it could be monthly, it could be quarterly, it could be twice a year, but making sure you've got a relationship with them and that they are in the know. And then keeping that contact database on hand. If something happens, how are you going to get a hold of them? How are you going to communicate that? And then finally, making sure that your organization has a consistent point person. If a stakeholder has a concern, who are they going to contact? And then do they know that person's phone number? Do they have emails? Do they know how to get in touch with you if they've got a concern? And then finally, there's this piece in uncertainty. How are you going to make agreements or decisions with stakeholders when you don't know what you're going to be doing in 6 months? I think of that kid toy where you squeeze the bottom and it is kind of like Jell-O in a tube. And so you might not be able to make decisions or agreements in times of uncertainty, but you can still define what's important for stakeholders. You know, maybe it's that they've got a creek trail that's really valuable to the community. You know that's valuable, and as you're making decisions kind of on the fly, you can use their value systems as an evaluation metric for deciding whether or not to proceed in a certain way. So I would say leveraging stakeholders through these partnerships, giving them responsibilities, recognizing their localized knowledge, by systematizing the process on your end, making sure you know how you're going to be engaging these stakeholders, and then finally defining what's important to them, will ensure that as you're adapting, as you're trying to keep up with whatever unforeseen circumstance it is, that you're not leaving the stakeholders behind.
Very well said. It seems like in a lot of this, you're putting ego aside and backing out and really just being attentive to kind of what that group is really interested in those situations. So. And that's a big part of it. It's not about your own kind of personal agenda, right? We're going to come back to a question for Jim in a second, but Summer, we haven't heard from you. Did you get your technological issues figured out? Let's see what you got. Nothing at all, Summer. No. There we go. Now you're back a little bit.
Well, I have a really loud voice. I can use my stage voice. Does that help?
Yeah, you might get kicked out of the space that you're in, but that's okay for us. We don't mind. So, Summer, question.
I can address it when we get to a question for me, you know, if we don't want to interrupt the flow. So
I can hear you just fine. Let's see some thumbs up from other people out there. Jim, can you hear? Emily? Okay, good. Yeah, I think we're good. So let's jump into a question for you, and then we're going to jump over to the Q&A if anybody has questions out there. And we'd like to, some banter between each of you if you have some things to react to from what you've heard from the other panelists. But let's talk to you about the university and college experience. So how can colleges and universities and mainstream adaptive capacity into their water quality programs? Basically, how can we prepare this emerging talent to deal with and operating in an uncertain climate?
Right, and I want to start by giving a shout out to sort of our sister institutions, because Red Rocks Community College, you know, we have both a bachelor's and an associate's in water quality management. But if there are listeners who are on the West Slope, you can also go to Colorado Mesa University, and we also have programs at Pikes Peak Community College. So that throughout the state, there's a lot of opportunities for students to get some water quality experience. As far as resilience, I think you couldn't hear me earlier. You know, this concept of resilience and the concept of adaptive capacity they're really linked in together. And so I think at science programs, we get off to a good start at setting the foundation. You know, we might teach students about resilience in terms of a rubber band. That's the one that I like to use. You know, how many times can you stretch that rubber band and still have it bounce back and maintain its shape, not get distorted? And then we move up to ecosystems, and we're talking about recovering and reorganizing after a catastrophe or a disturbance. Now that starts to sound familiar, right? But I think most technical programs end there. And one of the things that we tried to do when we added our bachelor's program was we added management. So we actually have 2 management classes, and the students do learn about strategic planning, about leadership, about these kinds of concepts that we're talking about that feed into adaptive capacity. I think we still have a ways to go though. I feel like we're still, collectively as a whole, using some old paradigms when it comes to planning, where we predict and we plan. We looked at the plausible scenarios. We gather data and we either pick the most probable scenario, or we want to pick the most scenario that we like the most. We want to just work in this direction, right? And one of the things that I've been able to work with is this concept of exploratory scenario planning. And this actually came out of industry. This came out of Royal Dutch Shell in the 90s. And it moves away from predict and plan to anticipate and adapt. Instead of looking at 1 or 2 scenarios that we really like or really think are going to happen, we need to look at a spectrum of scenarios and come up with strategies that are robust across different scenarios. So to kind of put that in today's climate, I hear a lot of people talking about when we go back to what it was like before COVID, right? And other people are like, it's never going away. And so that can cause some friction among scientists or stakeholders and who's right and who's wrong. The thing that we need to be doing is creating strategies that are going to work whether COVID goes away or COVID sticks around at the same kind of level that it is. And so that's kind of the different approach to planning. It's a huge paradigm shift. It's one we've been working with professionals on. And since most of our instructors are adjunct and come from the professional community, I think we can really start to roll that into our college classes. We are a bureaucracy. So while I might be able to have a conversation with our instructor and say, hey, why don't you do an exploratory scenario planning problem, like introduce that to them. If we want to change at the state level so that all of the colleges that are using our curriculum can implement it, you know, then that requires a stakeholder process, much like we were talking about with Emily. We've got to get our collaborators at the other colleges, at the system office together and agree on, you know, what are the changes that we need to make to our curriculum so that students have new tools, because we've got to give them tools different than what we've been using in the past.
Yeah, well said. And I think, you know, you are in the university system, and so you're the only bureaucracy that we're familiar with in this territory here, because none of us deal with that. Heavy sarcasm alert, heavy sarcasm alert. You know, and those bureaucracies don't necessarily adapt, move, change quickly. And, you know, COVID's the example of, you know, like, how do we now incorporate this into just this real world scenario into what we're doing? And I'm sure that we can make those, you know, references to American Tunnel, all those sort of things of like, the world continues to happen around us, right? And so we have to continually react to that. You used 2 phrases in there, or 2 words in there that I really liked, and I think it creates a really nice transition over to Jim for a question. And then let's open it up for a little bit after that. Is, you know, use the 2 terms anticipate and adapt. And so the question to Jim is, you know, do the current mining and reclamation policies or the regulations respond well to anticipated and unanticipated changes? And so is there a tool for determining the adaptability of programs or policies? So we're looking for that flexibility in what sometimes needs to be sort of a standard pass-fail kind of world when it comes down to, you know, regs. Take it over, Jim.
Well, first of all, earlier I was hoping to make some points, not necessarily.
Sorry about that.
but on how this adaptive capacity applies to mining and reclamation. And the problem with the mining industry right now is that there's market pressures, there's metals prices, societal acceptance is poor, nobody wants it in their backyard. You know, everybody wants the benefits of mining in their smartphone, their car, their laptop, but you name it, but nobody wants, you know, a disruptive activity. So there's this kind of mining's vulnerability, but then on the other side, it's got the mining resilience. And right now, the mining industry is moving away from fossil fuels. So what's going to replace it? And the resiliency side of this is that now they're going to have to be mining more cobalt, more nickel, more copper, you know, all this stuff. If the green technology, like, you know, this is not necessarily associated with what's behind me, but all this green technology has got to come from a hole in the ground. Even solar panels, you look at the silica, all the aluminum on the frames, all the glass, it's all going to come from a hole in the ground. So how these things are overlapping is showing that the mining industry, I think, even though they don't know that they're doing it, but they get it. I mean, they are adapting to the changing nature of society. You know, we're going to be mining more copper, and we're more going to be mining all this other stuff. And so on the reclamation side of things, the problems with that is with all the market values and market fluctuations, just when a mine is closing or about to close, the market could follow. And so now they've got a challenge is that, you know, they've got this money budgeted, you know, for closure, but now management is saying, oh, you know, well, wait a second, we really need to get this money out of your closure budget, maybe into reclamation, or excuse me, closure budget, but maybe into exploration or whatever. So there's that pressure, that reclamation vulnerability. But on the flip side of that, the reclamation resilience. So the smarter mining companies are going to be doing their concurrent reclamation, are going to stay up with it so that when closure does finally occur, their financial house is in order. And so they don't have to, you know, basically go bankrupt, and, you know, then the reclamation bond kicks in. And that's a big vulnerability for, you know, for us as society, is that the people who come in, if say a mine goes into, you know, closure and relinquishes its reclamation bond, the folks that are going to come in and fix it are not the people that work at the mine. And they understand all the systems, they understand the geology, they understand what needs to be done, and this third-party contractor is going to come in to do the bond, you know, bond work. So that's kind of what I was hoping to say earlier. But to answer your question about regulations, and read this as permits to mine, they're locked in before the mine even opens, and there's little, if any, opportunity to adapt to new technologies related to closure. Twice I've seen situations where a mine project is in regulatory review, so the permit application has been submitted, and the mine management is unwilling to even, you know, think about new and innovative technologies because it's not in their permit, and it would restart the permit clock. So they're saying, no, we can't talk about, you know, new technologies. We're on we got our blinders on. We're going to get this permit. It's locked in. Once they get their permit, hey, they're off and running, and closure is 20 years down the road. So there's that really a kind of a disconnect between permitting, regulatory side of things, and accepting, you know, innovative technology. I wish there was a way that you could do a permit and, you know, leave the door open, you know, while the permit's under review, saying, hey, look, we've got this great new pixie dust that has become available, or pixie juice, if you will, that we can utilize and really make this a better mine plan, but don't restart the clock. So that's my 2 cents.
I think you need to rename the spent grain leachate to pixie juice. Just a personal idea, and trademark that before I get to it here at the end. So we're a good bit over on time, and so if we can just keep this last little quick series of questions, or responses from you all, just keep them as short as you can, if you don't mind. Sorry about that. But let's come back to what Summer said there, and anticipate and adapt. I think about Chris's stuff really easily on this, as far as like, you do your best coming in with situations, you learn more about the chemistry of what you're dealing with, the permitting process, where the real opportunities are, anticipate and adapt, right? So how do you do that? How do you do that in a regulatory framework where the permits are, it's a slow process, it's an expensive process. So if anybody wants to jump in there around those two words of, even like Emily with you, how do you anticipate what's coming and what changes, when you're working in a regulatory framework with a community that's impacted by the inability of bureaucracies maybe to be nimble? Anybody, jump in.
Well, I'll chime in on this because I've been in government pretty much my entire career, minus a few short nonprofit stints. And we have got to find a way to make bureaucracy more nimble, like you said, Anthony. And I think we tend to forget that a bureaucracy is comprised of humans, of individuals. And what I'm seeing is that there's sometimes you get that one person, I don't know, Jim, if you had this experience, that helps you cut through all the red tape. And they can move your application across processes. You don't see that very often, but when you do, it is so refreshing. And so I've heard this from water and wastewater treatment plants, for example. In order to get rid of sort of those silos that exist, they're looking for managers who understand watershed protection and the nuts and bolts of wastewater treatments. And so we've got to make those bureaucracies more nimble. And one way to do that is to just create a position that has the ability to make those decisions, cut across those layers, and introduce that new technology without restarting the permit process. And so I think we absolutely just have to find a way to restructure our bureaucracies. And it doesn't mean dismantling them. It means it could be as simple as creating this new position that is someone who recognizes the connections.
Yep. So one end of the spectrum, risk takers, the other end of the spectrum, bureaucratic, what would you call that? Inertia. And so that's a really tough to create that nimble environment, but I appreciate you kind of weaving those two concepts together. So nicely done. Emily, Chris?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. We use a spectrum quite often that ranges from information, kind of a one-way communication strategy, to active engagement, which is a two-way. Stakeholders are directly involved in decision-making. And in most bureaucracies, you'll fall more on that information side, maybe consultations where there's some engagement, but it's very separate from decision-making processes. I will say most bureaucracies could really benefit from empowering stakeholders to help move that needle. Most state employees that I've met really care about the work they're doing, but they are bogged down in the same system. And so it's not that they don't want to move the needle, it's just that the system is working against them in some ways. And there's a hesitation to engaging stakeholders, which is ironic in the state because those are the taxpayers who are directly part of that cycle. But so I'll just say I don't have an easy fix, but there is a real opportunity to take communities alongside as partners instead of distancing them from the problem.
Yeah, that's well said. Having worked with some Superfund projects and using technical assistant grant money, there's a difference between informing the community of what's happening in their backyard versus engaging them. And that's really hard, I would say, for the EPA, is to say, community, they're not saying community, what would you like? They're saying community, this is what we can do. And this is the very defined box we have to work in. But I think what helps alleviate the sort of tension around that is when you can engage them in a way that brings up their knowledge level of being like, hey, these regs are actually pretty solid, and we're doing things protective of the local environment. And then trying to find ways to make it, I would back to Summer's point of making it fit locally to what the solution needs to happen for, not just the treatment process or whatever the end result is, but also that watershed health is considered as part of that, community health is considered as part of that. So trying to tie some things together there. Chris, any final thoughts on anticipate and adapt? I'm sure your process has been completely linear.
Yeah, no final thoughts, but this has been a good discussion. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Well, I appreciate the panel making time. Everybody give them a big round of applause for being part of the panel today and talking adaptive capacity. We're going to do one more trivia question and get you out of here. We're